We need to move beyond researching belief change is the title of the talk. Up on to Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm the research manager at Full Fact, and it's my job to learn from academic research to see how we can tackle misinformation most effectively. Most of you will know who Full Fact are. We challenge misinformation and hold to account the people and organisations that help it spread. And fact-checking is at the heart of how we do this, and we use fact-checking as part of a range of tools to hold to account people and organisations. We've started a research programme with Factcheck and Chequeado to learn from existing academic research and to conduct our own research to find out how we can tackle misinformation most effectively. We found so far from research that false beliefs can be corrected most of the time. We've also found that how you do that and the context in which you're seeking to do that matters, and we need to understand a lot more about that. I want to talk today about 6 questions that I think we need to understand better to be able to work out what interventions work best when it comes to tackling misinformation online. So my first question is, what are the most important problems to tackle? When Full Fact talks about tackling misinformation, we talk about the harm caused by bad information. So it could be disengagement from democracy, interference in democracy, economic harm, or risk to life. Now, a lot of the research that I come across when I look into research on misinformation online has tended to focus on false news, so fabricated news articles, or it's tended to maybe to look at foreign interference on Twitter and other online platforms. And that makes sense because we know that these are novel forms of how information spreads online. But actually, I think we need to do a lot more to understand how traditional forms of misinformation spread online. So claims made by politicians, for example, how do those spread online? Where are the most harms coming from? And actually looking at what combination of the person putting out the information, the type of misinformation, and the medium on which it travels. So what combination of those factors causes most harm? In the UK, television is still the main platform that most people get their news. That does differ depending on age, so for 16 to 24-year-olds, internet is the main place that they get their news. But for the majority of UK adults, television is still the most common platform that we're using. And actually, if you look at how many people say they only use the internet, it's only 13% of UK adults that say they only use the internet for news. So I think that's really important context for this. I know we're talking about misinformation online, but actually there's still really influential other platforms for how we get our information that are influencing us. So what I'd like to propose is that I think we need to understand more about how misinformation spreads between these platforms, and actually, as has already been talked about, how can we understand how it moves from one to another and where there is most harm. So for example, does a false news site, does that have more or less influence on a voter during an election than, say, a politician making a claim in a TV interview? I don't think we have a good handle on that as it is. I know that there has been some research starting to look at this. So Genevieve Gorel and colleagues at Sheffield found that key claims made by each campaign during the e-referendum were far more influential on social media than Russian-backed media and propaganda accounts. Second question is, what is the public communications need? And I think Rasmus did a really good job of talking about this earlier. So we know that the internet has given us more access to information, and that's great. But we also know that people find it really hard to know who or what to trust. So 81% of people globally said that they found it hard to know who or what to trust due to contradictory information. And we also heard from Rasmus earlier that actually when you ask people about fake news in focus groups, that they see it as quite a broad problem. So it could encompass anything from poor journalism to propaganda to advertising. And actually then false news is kind of separated from what others might describe as real news, more as a issue of degree rather than these kind of two really delineated issues. Actually, if you ask people how confident they are, whether they can tell real news from fake news. Actually, most of us in the UK say that we think we can. We're pretty confident. Now, you might guess the punchline of this from Tom's presentation just now, but actually when you ask about the average person, that's when we all say, oh no, I don't trust the average person to be able to identify fake news. So only 28% of British adults are confident that the average person can spot fake news. And this is one other piece of research from the Reuters Institute with young people where, again, this was kind of more qualitative research where they found that young people actually saw fake news more of a nuisance rather than a problem, which I thought was really interesting. And they felt like the public attention that it was getting was actually not deserved. So to me, this shows quite a kind of mixed picture. We see that people are worried about fake news, they're worried about what to trust, but actually when you ask them, are you able to identify what is true, what you can trust, then most people say that we think we can do a good job, it's just other people who have that problem. And the reason why I think it matters that we need a better answer to this is because it's not clear to me if we should be encouraging people to be more distrusting of the information that they come across, or whether everyone is already distrusting even of their own reactions, and we simply need to just help them work out how to evaluate information. So next question, what interventions work for what types of claims? There are many different ways to define different types of claims. So for example, whether they're a numerical claim, a claim about the law, or maybe a false image, or you can define them by the topic. So whether they're a political claim or maybe a health claim. I want to concentrate here on the level of entrenchment of an issue. We still don't really know what actually drives belief in misinformation. So there are a few competing accounts. I'm sure most of you, we've again already talked about a bit earlier, will have heard of the motivated reasoning account. Actually, our belief in information and misinformation is driven by our political beliefs. And one proponent of this account, Dan Kahan and colleagues, have put forward that actually people who think more analytically and who have strong political beliefs will use that analytical thinking to end up believing information that supports their beliefs more strongly. And there's evidence of that happening in areas like gun control and climate change. An alternative account is that belief in false news may actually be driven by our impulsive reactions, so people failing to think or just sort of judging something instinctively rather than taking the time to analyze it. And they found that with false news headlines. And what I think this shows us is that actually we need to be really careful about what types of information we're researching when we come to looking at what drives belief in misinformation and what interventions work. So we know that for these more entrenched issues like gun control and climate change, potentially there's something different going on there to when people are evaluating false news headlines on social media. So what works in one context might not work in another context. So I think it's important we're thinking about these during an election as well, that where issues and claims become particularly sensitive and heightened, or with issues like vaccine hesitancy. So these are two examples of false claims that we fact-checked from Facebook. And the first is the claim that coughing repeatedly and vigorously can help someone survive a heart attack if they're alone. This is not true. People may have seen this online and may have believed this, but we can probably suspect that it's not necessarily something people had a prior belief on. Then if you look at the second one, this is relating to vaccinations. So it's just suggesting that if you've been recently vaccinated, you need to stay away from these vulnerable groups. And I think that actually we need to be thinking about how we're responding to these two claims. So again, this is the second one, ties to much more entrenched topics and debates, and we've just heard about how people will take a lot of time to research these topics, and I think we can't, through the Facebook third-party fact-checking program, we can help reduce the further spread of those claims. But when it comes to people who have seen these already, I think we need to be thinking more about, do we need to be responding to these more complicated topics in a different way to how we respond to topics like the heart attack claim, where it's something that someone's just come across once and it's not necessarily linked to these kind of more entrenched topics. So, fourth question, what factors influence belief and spread in misinformation around the world? We've talked about motivated reasoning, and I think we need a better handle of how that works around the world. Most of the research we have on fact-checking on misinformation generally comes from the US, where we know that politics is particularly polarized. And it's not clear how these effects might generalize to issues or countries where politics is less polarized, or where other allegiances like religious, generational, or other factors like literacy rates might affect how people respond to information, how they believe information. There's evidence from Australia, for example, that racial attitudes might behave in this way. And actually, even in the UK, there's been recent research into polarisation where they found that polarisation is actually quite different. So on some key issues of public debate, like health in the US, people are quite polarised depending on what party they lean towards, whereas in the UK, this report found that actually there's not as much a big gap between people. And one other example of this is from research by Bryony Swire-Thompson and her colleagues they conducted an experiment in Australia and the US where they showed people, first of all, one group received fact checks of politicians where they made an equal proportion of claims that were accurate and inaccurate. And then another group received fact checks of claims where they made a disproportionate number of inaccurate claims. And they found in the US this made no impact on people's feelings towards those politicians. Actually, in Australia, they found it did make a big effect and it did reduce people's feelings towards those politicians. So I think that's a really interesting case where even in these two countries, that the US, Australia, we might think are actually more similar, even there they found these quite big differences. And even if we had the answers to all of these questions, I think we need to think more about information quality and accountability online. And this is the focus of my last two questions. So I know this conference is about trust online, so hopefully this has been talked about. I know this has been talked about a bit already. But I think we talk a lot about how to reduce the spread of inaccurate news, and I think it's really important that we don't forget about how we can promote reliable, accurate information and what works to build trust in that information, because without that, we know that bad information can arise from a lack of good information being available to people. This is just one example of how our content appears on Facebook, and just on a very practical level for us, one question we have of people searching for information online who come across our work for the first time: what information do we need to be presenting in this way that might help them judge who we are and why we're showing them this information, whether it's trustworthy. We've wondered about things like whether we should be separating out the source information that we're using. And lastly, we focus a lot on belief change when it comes to fact-checking. But at Full Fact, we're looking to do more than that. We're looking to affect behaviour so that we can prevent bad information from arising in the first place. The way we do this is through fact-checking, which helps maintain scrutiny of people putting out claims, and then seeking corrections when we found claims that are inaccurate. But we can't do this quite in the same way online. It's often not necessarily possible to contact the person where the original claim or post came from, and it's also often not possible to seek a correction from the original source, as it were. One example where there is a way we can do something like this is through the Facebook third-party fact-checking scheme. So through this scheme, this further spread of posts will be limited, and posts will appear further down people's news feeds. But it also notifies people who have shared the post that it has been fact-checked. We sometimes and quite often get complaints from people who have had their posts fact-checked saying, who are you, why are you fact-checking my post? I've been told that you've checked it on Facebook. And what I'd be really interested in seeing and doing is more research that actually looks at how can we use opportunities like this to communicate, again, who we are, what we're trying to do, so that we can create a bit more of a positive impact for these individuals and for their future behaviour. So these are the questions that I've talked about today that I'm really interested in answering. If you're to take away one piece of information from this talk, I think it's that context really matters. The types of claims that we're trying to intervene on, the types of misinformation, the countries in which we're seeking to make interventions. There may well be differences there that we need to take account of, and I think it's really important that any interventions that are being done in this space takes that into account. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience here?
Thank you. So this is a question I have which also pertains to the previous speaker as well. So I'm wondering whether time and the little amount of time that people have to deal with a lot of information is a factor both in the spread of misinformation and also how they are, letting their bias take over and or not. So I'm just wondering whether there's been any work on measuring that somehow.
I'm not aware that there has been, and I think actually a big problem we have with research in our area is that a lot of it is sort of lab experiments. We don't have that much research actually in the wild where people are coming across misinformation to understand how those beliefs are coming about in the first place, and also how our interventions are appearing in those circumstances. So I think it's a great question, and yeah, I'm not aware of research on it.
More final question from anyone? Let me just add that I really messed that introduction up. What I really meant to say is I'm grateful for Full Fact, not just for the work that they generally do, but for the enormous share of the organization that many of them have put into this conference. And I did not communicate that at all. Anyway, thank you very much, Amy, particularly, and please another round of applause for her and the team.